Kia ora, this is Liz. Welcome to James Blaze. If you haven't subscribed yet, can you do that now and click the bell icon? That'll tell you when a new video drops. Also, if you have, at the end of the video, if you've liked the video, can you give me a like? That just helps the algorithm to start to think, hey, that's something I can promote. And if you are new to the channel and don't know what's going on, can I suggest you go look at the intro video so that you do know what's going on. Otherwise, grab your Bible and we will dig on in. And today we are finishing John chapter 5. And so we are reading verses 45 to 47. I'll read them for you now. Do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So, do remember this is Jesus' defense, right? So he closes his defense with an accusation, but it doesn't come from him. He says, do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There he goes, making himself out to be someone who can just casually chat to God. The word accuse means to make an accusation, obviously, to charge or prosecute. It's where we get our word categorical from, which means unambiguously explicit and direct. To be a categorical liar is to be an obvious liar. To make this kind of an accusation is to accuse somebody of something that is obvious. In one very real sense, Jesus doesn't need to accuse these men of any kind of sin because the people know how sinful they are, so the Father most certainly will as well. Their sin probably rises to heaven in much the same way that Sodom and Gomorrah's did. So Jesus doesn't need to accuse them, and indeed he will not, because there's already one who does accuse them before the Father, and that someone is Moses. Not necessarily the person of Moses, although that may come into play here. Jesus may be using the language of the Hebrews, who would often call the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Torah, or the books of the law by the Jews, by the name of the one who wrote them. So in that case, that would be Moses. Now, there is debate amongst scholars over the authorship of these 5 books. So that would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So there is debate, but the Jews seem fairly convinced it was Moses, and I kind of think, well, it's their scriptures, so maybe we shouldn't argue with them. Jesus clearly sees Moses as the author. So even though it's obvious that the last chapter of Deuteronomy was in fact written by someone else, and you can tell that because it talks about his death, which would seem unlikely to be written by the person who died, right? So apart from that chapter, I'm quite happy to accept Moses as the writer. Maybe not the one who did the physical writing, because maybe he just dictated and someone else did the physical writing, but I would be quite happy to say that Moses wrote them. So we have to ask ourselves, is this what Jesus was referring to, right? The first five books of the Bible. Is there something within those first 5 books, the Torah, that directly accuses these men? I think truly there is. The learned men of Israel put a lot of stock in Moses' words. The whole foundation of the Jewish faith is set upon those first 5 books. In many ways, the stories contained, particularly in Genesis, are reworked over and over again throughout the history of Israel. And so it could be that Jesus is pointing to the fact that there is prophecy within those 5 books that proves his position, or it could be that Jesus is in fact saying that how Moses acted compared to how they act condemns them. 2 possible explanations for Jesus' words, so let's have a look at them both. First, prophecies. So are there specific references to Jesus in the Torah? The first intimation we have of a messianic figure is in the Garden of Eden, where it says, so Yahweh said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and every beast of the field. On your belly will you go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So from the very foundation of the world, there's been this promise of one to come, one who would crush the head of the snake. That would be the Satan, even as the Satan strikes his heel. The Israelites were on the lookout for this one to come throughout their history. For a time, David appeared to look like he could be the one, as did many other judges and kings, but every one of them failed in some respect. And so we get to Jesus' day without that one to come having come, and now the prophecies that Daniel brought up are now starting to come into play. The one to come, according to Daniel, was meant to come, or meant to be arriving, at the time that Jesus arrived. We're not going to look into Daniel, because Jesus specifically said it was Moses who would accuse these men, but feel free to look up Daniel for yourselves. So we've got to ask, what else is hiding in plain view in Moses' work, right? Well, you have the promise to Abraham, which included the promise of the whole world being blessed through Abraham's seed. That's not conclusive evidence, of course, because the entire Jewish nation came out of Abraham's seed, but it's still evidence of a promise that is reiterated with Isaac and then again with Jacob. Then you have that remarkable picture of Abraham taking Isaac up a mountain to be a sacrifice. So the promised son becomes a sacrifice, but then God provides the sacrifice himself. That would be the ram in the thicket. This whole event is a picture of Jesus being the sacrifice. Of course, at the point we're reading at the moment in John, that is still not on the radar. Moving on then to Jacob and Israel's blessings over his son on his deathbed. If we look at the blessing over Judah, which is of course Jesus's tribe, we have this. So this is Genesis 49:10. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the prey. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down, like a lioness who dares to rouse him. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes and the allegiance of the nations is his. So, Judah's name means praise. Leah called him that because she praised the Lord when she had him. As her fourth son, Judah had no right to be praised by his brothers or be given any kind of scepter. The right of inheritance should really have gone to Reuben, the firstborn, which would seem to indicate that the idea of a firstborn inheritance doesn't mean much to God. The Jews may have been God's chosen and elect people, his firstborn if you will, but that doesn't mean they were always going to have it their own way. That phrase, until Shiloh comes, is believed by the bulk of scholars and rabbis to refer to the coming of the Messiah. Though Shiloh is the name of a place, the way it's used in context here makes it much more likely to be the name of a person. The scepter has, of course, now passed from Judah, so scepters were a symbol of kingship. There is no king of Israel, you'll know that, right? So Messiah was expected. So then we have Passover and the spotless lamb, whose blood redeemed the Israelites from the angel of death. Another allusion to Jesus' death on the cross. More applicable, though, to Jesus' argument to these men right this instant is a few of the lyrics of the song that the Israelites sang after the Red Sea crossing. I'm not going to sing it to you, but I will say it. So it says, this is Exodus 15:2, the Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. He has become my salvation. Did you get that? You could see it in the practical sense that at the time God had literally just saved them from the Egyptian army. But then if you think about it in the context of Jesus, God has literally become our salvation, has he not? And then we have Moses himself, standing in the gap, prepared to sacrifice himself a couple of times really to prevent God destroying the entire Israelite nation. I don't know if you knew this, but back when they made the golden calf, there were a couple of times in there where God was like, yep, I'm done with this lot. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from Exodus 32, 7-14. So Moses is up the mountain with God, and the Israelites are at the foot of the mountain making a golden calf, apparently, the God that brought them out of Egypt. Anyway, where am I going? 7-14. The Lord said to Moses, go get down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way in which I commanded them. They've made themselves a moulded calf. and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." So none of this is making any sense, just saying. The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people." Way truly there. "Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation." That's quite a deal, really, isn't it? So this is how Moses responds. Then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, "Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you've brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I've spoken of I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever." So the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. So Moses goes down and deals with all that stuff. And then the next day he says this, right? This is verses 30 to 33. "And it came to pass on the next day that Moses said to the people, You've sinned a great sin. And now I will go to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Oh, these people have sinned a great sin and have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written." And the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book." So Moses is prepared to be blotted out of God's book in order to save the people. And this is a people he doesn't always like hanging out with. And then, not long before his death, when the people are back on the eastern side of the Jordan, preparing to go into the promised land, Moses, who is of course not permitted to go in and knows he's dying, goes over all the commandments and precepts with the people. It covers a lot, and I mean a lot, of Deuteronomy. But at one point in his long speech, Moses says this, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command them. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." There it is, the way that Moses accuses them. The word for require there means to avenge or seek recompense. And this particular verse is pretty damning where the Sanhedrin are concerned. Here is a prophet, one such as Moses, one greater than Moses, who's speaking in God's name, and they are not listening to him. 'Tis a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a loving God, don't you think? Especially if you have deliberately blinded your own eyes to the truth of a matter. Jesus was very right. He doesn't need to accuse them before his Father. They've already made themselves guilty. It was Moses who they leaned on, relied on, trusted in. And yet, when Jesus heals the man who is blind from birth, the Pharisees question him about this healing. Their responses to this man are very telling and will well prove Jesus' point. Let's go take a look at it, shall we? This is John 9. I'm going to read quite a section, 9:13 to 21. "So they brought him, who was formerly blind, to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes." Oh dear. "Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. And others said, How can a man who's a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them. They said to the blind man again, What do you say about him? Because he opened your eyes. And the blind man answered, He's a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called his parents, right? And they asked his parents, saying, Is this your son who you say was born blind? And how then does he now see? And his parents say, they've got to be careful, right? Because their heads are on the block. The parents say, We know this is our son. We know he was born blind. We don't know how he sees. Ask him. He's old enough. He'll tell you. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. I hope you don't mind. So they again call the man, right, who was born blind, and they say, give God the glory. We know this man is a sinner. The man they're referring to then is Jesus, right? So the blind man says, I don't know if he's a sinner or not, but one thing I do know, I was blind and now I see. Keeping to the facts there is a good idea. And then they said, well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he's like, do I have to tell you this again? I told you already. Do you want to be one of his disciples? And they say, you are his disciple, but we are Moses's. Ah, we know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know where he's from. There's an old saying my mother taught me, and it fits these guys pretty well. They're not so blind as those that whinny see. So that's prophecy, right? Those are the prophecies that could possibly be accusing these men. But what about Moses' behaviour? How he acted as a leader? Does that accuse these men? And so therefore was Jesus literally saying that Moses himself will be their accuser? When you consider how Moses stood in the gap for the sinners, and those ones I read to you were after the debacle with the golden calf, right? If you think about how he interceded on behalf of the nation a number of times when they really ticked God off, you can see that the leadership style of Moses was one of sacrifice. True, there were a number of times where they ticked Moses off as well, but what he didn't do, which is what the members of the various groups making up the Sanhedrin do, is rip the people off, twist God's words to their own advantage, mistreat widows and orphans, and basically treat the people as their own little cash cow. Why would Jesus need to accuse these men? They're hell-bent on proving their disloyalty to God all by themselves. They didn't actually need God's help. Thing is, these guys were so sure that they were right, that they were in the right, that they couldn't face the possibility that they might just possibly, potentially be wrong. Their adherence to the rules of Moses, their dogged determination to cross every T and dot every I, to tithe on even their mint and their cumin in order to look holy, had made them overconfident in their own salvation. In fact, it's almost like they'd made an idol out of keeping the law. They were assured they were going to heaven after death because they, not God, had made themselves holy. Jesus tells them that they are too concerned with the little things, but neglecting the more important things, justice and mercy. They trusted in their bloodlines and their day-to-day adherence to even the minutest of the laws to see them through, but they had no mercy. The whole reason they were even having this debate is because Jesus healed someone on a Sabbath. Was that really such a terrible thing? Really? How did they get to the point of thinking that healing someone, which is clearly God's work and certainly a work of compassion and mercy, was a bad thing, even if it was done on a Saturday? Moses' laws included things like justice and mercy. They aren't just guilty because they missed the prophecies related to Jesus. They're also guilty because they haven't actually kept the law as perfectly as they think they have. They were ripping off their parents by calling the money that should have been used to look after them Corban, which meant it was set apart for God and they didn't have to use it for their parents. It was set apart for God. The funny thing about anything that was Corban, it didn't have an end date. So, they didn't have to pay it till after they were dead. And that was just one of the ways that they were showing their disrespect of God, their disbelief of God. Because if they really believed there was a God, they wouldn't be acting this way. Isn't that true of humans today? Do they not behave in a fashion that would indicate they really don't believe there are eternal consequences for their actions? Jesus won't be the accuser. You know that, right? Satan is the accuser. Jesus is the judge, not the accuser. But neither really does he need to be. They're already guilty. They already missed the most important thing, the love of God. He says, if you had believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote about me, or wrote concerning me, which is a better reading because it makes you understand that Moses didn't just mention Jesus or allude to a someday someone coming, but wrote all about Jesus. The word about or concerning is peri, meaning all around on every side, which is why it's the base of our word perimeter. It means Moses wrote everything about Jesus, everything they needed to know, and they missed it, or they refused to see it. It's not necessarily obvious to modern eyes that the words of the Torah speak of Jesus over and over again in types, in shadows, in discourse, in allegory. We might be excused for not seeing it, but these guys, they were steeped in the scriptures. They pored over them night and day. They should have seen him for who he was well before the man born blind. They think they believed Moses, of course, but Jesus points out the irony of that belief. If you believed him, you would believe me. They didn't believe Jesus, which means they didn't really believe Moses either. These two lacks of belief prove each other, just as their inability to come to Jesus proves that they don't really have the love of God within them. When Jesus met two of his disciples after the resurrection on the road to Emmaus, he does this. Beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So those two disciples had an excuse for not understanding why Jesus died on a cross or where his body was. They were unlearned men, right? The members of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, had no excuse whatsoever. Now, I've speculated a number of times about this group, and I suspect I'll be speculating about them till we end this study. Why these learned men, so well versed in their own scriptures, should be so dull as to not realize who Jesus was. But here we might have our answer, right? They don't believe Jesus because according to Jesus, they didn't really believe Moses. Now that's quite a statement, isn't it? How would you feel if someone came up to you and said, you didn't really believe Jesus? Initially, you'd possibly brush it off. But if you're being honest, you might want to check your own behaviour and see if it does in fact make it obvious that you do believe Jesus. Not just in him, but in his words. Your lifestyle and words, the way you treat people, these are all indicators of whether or not you actually believe Jesus. It's not enough to just read the words. We must hear and obey, to shema them. It's a lifelong commitment to improving, growing, and becoming a true reflection of God. When we first become Christians, he wipes our slate clean. We look like a newly made and newly cleaned mirror, reflecting God's glory with strength, but time and tides often mar the image. There should be times in our lives when we polish the mirror again, times when we consider our behaviour in the light of Jesus' teaching, time to ask ourselves, are we really believing in Jesus? Do our actions prove this to be true? Would people looking at us know we were Christians? Also consider this over the next week. If one believes in Jesus, then one must also believe in Moses, for he wrote of Jesus. It goes both ways, you know. Jesus' doctrine and life were built upon the foundation of the Torah. There are stories in there that point directly at Jesus if we have the eyes to see them. Modern Christians who reject the God of the Old Testament in favour of just concentrating on Jesus do themselves a great disservice. Jesus is hidden all over the Old Testament, and much truth is to be garnered from seeking him out amongst those ancient stories. After all, what is history but his story? That is all I have for you this week. I pray a blessing on your household and yourselves and your endeavours, and pray that I will see you again healthy and whole next week. Ka kite anō.